On May the 18th, we arrived at the border with Canada, and the controls were short and sweet, with a UK passport and a right-hand drive vehicle making it easy. We were asked if we had any guns or alcohol, a negative to both, and we were across the border at Carway. Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II had also arrived in Canada that very same day, and the lady at the visitor centre in Cardston asked me if we travelled on the same plane. Our first stop was at the Great Canadian Barn Dance RV Resort, which had great views of the snow-capped Rockies. The huge lake had all sorts of geese and ducks with chicks, beavers and a yellow-headed blackbird, and a big flock of migrating tree swallows. The owners had a fine collection of old farm machinery and a display about the settlers and how they became the very first Mounties. So it was appropriate that our next visit was to Fort MacLeod and the Museum of the Northwest Mounted Police. Looking just like a large child's toy fort, in the parade ground the Union flag was flying. And it was here another passenger joined our bus. Officer Black Bear, a Mountie. This is a windy part of Alberta due to the way the currents are affected by the mountains. And the World Heritage Site at Head Smashed In Buffalo Jump would be our next stop. Here the First Nation tribes would cleverly direct the buffalo into a funnel made by very brave young men who clothed themselves in skins and hid in the grass. This man-made track caused the animals to stampede to the cliff edge, where they fell over and were killed down below. Only sufficient animals to fulfill the needs of the families were killed, and the campsite on the plain by the river became a factory to process every part of the animal. This activity had been carried out for over 5,000 years, and the visitor centre built into the cliff was very, very interesting. Archaeologists working at the site have found evidence of man's activity here going back over 9,000 years. And sad to say, when the white man arrived with the guns and began to decimate the buffalo, the herds no longer came past and the site fell out of use. We had a very early start one day to get to the Lancaster Museum at Nanton, south of Calgary, where the gate guard is an Avro CF100 Canuck. The accent of the lady at the desk was a surprise. She was a Geordie. The whole family now live in Ontario, and her husband is an expert on Merlin engines, so they spend their holidays working at the museum. The Lancaster was in excellent condition, and Jim spent ages inside, and we had a very interesting time looking around all the exhibits, including a memorial to all the fallen Canadian airmen in World War II. This house was on the move as we set off to visit Vulcan, where the visitor centre is a Star Trek station. It's a very small town which has become a mecca for all Trekkies, and has made most of its name with a huge Starship Enterprise outside and a star plaque. Inside is an actual flight deck from the TV show and lots of models of the crew, and there are costumes so visitors can dress up for a photo shoot, so we just had to do this. There's everything imaginable to do with space for sale, along with greetings from other towns called Vulcan around the world, and even one from the Vulcan bomber at Sunderland Air Museum. There were still lots of wild animals around, and at the Tillybrook campsite near Brook we watched the antics of a family of groundhogs. It was Victoria Day and a national holiday on the 23rd of May, and also Alberta centenary celebrations, which the Queen had attended in Jasper, Calgary and Edmonton. So all the campsites were very busy, even though it was raining. Spring flowers are in bloom everywhere, western anemones and wild roses, and a bunch of twitchers arrived at the campsite to carry out the annual bird count. On now into the Badlands and a great campsite in the Dinosaur Provincial State Park, another World Heritage Site. This whole area is littered with the remains of dinosaurs, and the skeletons are still being excavated. We rode our mountain bikes around the inner road, stopping to read the information boards which tell the story of how the bones were found, and to see for ourselves the preserved remains of these extinct mammals. It's an unusual place and amazing to see all the bones so close to the surface. Some have been covered over with glass frames to prevent people from removing them. As the sun set, the cliffs here took on a whole new colour. It was very dramatic. Our route took us northwards across the prairie until we dropped down into a river valley full of green cottonwood trees and passed by the old Atlas mining complex and a town called Dorothy. Our lunch stop was at the Hoodoos, unusual grey formations, but smaller than we'd expected. The photographs we'd seen were taken from low down to make the outcrops look much taller than they really are. Following the river, we arrived at the Rosedale Tipple and a famous historic suspension bridge that was built to allow the miners access across the river. This bridge has been replaced and rebuilt so many times it's a bit like Trigger's brush. So nothing is original. The wooden slats have been replaced with steel. So even though it's a historic bridge, it's actually all new. In the town of Drumheller, we found this huge life-size model of a dinosaur outside the shops, and Jim is dwarfed by its feet. Thankfully, the campsite bunnies were a more normal size, but the sign did amuse us. Do not abuse the bunnies. The Red Deer River Valley has spectacular scenery, especially at Horse Thief Canyon, and it was hunters travelling on the river in boats who spotted the huge bones sticking out of the cliffs that started the fossil rush. In this area are many museums, one about gopher holes, another about cartwheels, but we pulled in to visit the newly opened Royal Tyrrell Museum. Built on the site where Joseph Burr Tyrrell discovered the skull of an Albertosaurus in 1884, it nestles in the hillside and tells the story of the fossil hunting history of Alberta. It houses one of the world's largest collection of dinosaur skeletons, many from the site at Drumheller, and also tells the story of the Earth with magnificent dioramas just up to the time that human beings arrived on the planet. We then followed the marked dinosaur trail, looking down on magnificent strata until it was time to cross the Red Deer River on the small Blériot ferry. Yes, that's right, it was built by the brother of the famous aviator who was the first to fly across the English Channel. Northwards towards Edmonton, we stopped at Wetaskiwin to visit a completely different museum, the Alberta Reynolds, which has a fine collection of aircraft and vehicles. Parked outside were a Sabre, a Canuck and an F-104 and a rare Bristol 172 which had just arrived. Inside, Jim found a painting and a model of a mosquito and a very old, reputed to be the very first, skidoo. There was an exhibition entitled The Life of the Motorcycle, and it contained many old British bikes, off-roaders, an Ellie Vela set, a military bombardier, and a familiar machine that we'd seen before. This is the Dakar machine belonging to Lawrence Hacking, and we had met him and his machine at the 2001 Dakar Bivvy in Morocco. We pulled in for fuel in Rocky Mountain House, and we were joined by lots of RVs towing motocross bikes, so we followed them to a motocross course where we spent the weekend. The event was organised by ADRA, Alberta Dirt Riders Association, who oversee club events, and this was their biggest event in the province. Here we admired all the machinery and saw the latest coloured tyres. We enjoyed the fast and furious racing, kids who never gave an inch, and laughed at the sign on one exhaust pipe that said, "Just put me back on the bike." There were lots of ladies, one or two beating the boys, and veterans, and we met Pete and Jeanette de Graaf, who used to be involved with the Canadian ISDE team. Their son now races motocross, so Dad was having a go in the vets class, but still would prefer to ride in enduros. The dust got worse, and there were some very bad crashes on the long start straight, but it was good to be amongst all the off-roaders again, and they made us very welcome. At the nearby Crimson Lake Provincial Park, we set up camp beside the lake, and the weather began to improve. Out came the bikes, and we went exploring along the dirt roads through the First Nation OCS homeland. The bridges through their land were built too small, so the huge logging trucks cannot come through. It's a good idea as they make up so much dust. We crossed the Brazier Dam, and after getting petrol in Lodgepole, we returned to ride out to the huge sluice gates and back alongside the lovely river and through the Sunchild First Nation Reservation. Our onward journey continued following the North Saskatchewan River. We headed towards the Rocky Mountains and visited the National Historic Site near Rocky Mountain House. In 1799, the North West Company of Montreal and then the Hudson Bay Company had trading posts where the two companies waged fierce competition for 21 years to trade with the Aboriginals and the French fur trappers for animal skins. All that remains today are two brick chimneys, some play forts for the kids, and walking trails with information plaques, and a display of historical artefacts at the visitor centre. After a wet night under the trees at Fish Lake Campground, we stopped at the viewpoint at Bighorn Dam to see the bright blue water before heading along the Icefields Parkway and into Lake Louise. This is a World Heritage Site, and the scenery and wildlife is unbelievable. And we stopped at Bow Pass to walk through the forest to Lake Peyto and marvel at the colour of the water. High up on the scree, we spotted some hardy climbers making their way down to the edge of the glacier. As we got near to Lake Louise, we saw a black bear walking along the edge of the forest clearing, our very first bear. The campsite was okay, and after another rainy night, we got out the mountain bikes to visit the town, and were surprised to see old railway carriages that were being used as a cafe. This narrow valley contains the main Highway 1, the railway along which the Canadian Pacific Company run long trains carrying grain which spills out. The black bears are attracted to the smell of this spillage, and sadly many are killed on the tracks. Out on the dirt bikes we were disappointed to find many trails closed. A ranger explained that the park service does not get sufficient funds to clear the winter rockfalls. At Lake Moraine we hiked out onto the rockfall to see the view. The mountain scenery with forests and deep blue lakes is spectacular. Driving back south along the parkway, we saw a big brown bear, a grizzly, enjoying a meal of daffodils near the sign for a closed campsite. He was huge, and a ranger arrived complete with pump shotgun and moved on all the vehicles from the bear jam. It was pouring with rain when we got to Banff. We just had a short walk to visit the famous Fairmount Railway Hotel before I went for a swim in the upper hot springs. This outdoor pool is full of mineral water at a constant 40 degrees. It was a strange sensation to be swimming outside in the warm water in the pouring rain. And here I chatted with a group of visitors from Prague. On down through Katuni National Park, we crossed the Continental Divide and are now in British Columbia. All the water in the rivers now runs towards the Pacific Ocean. The weather improved as we drove through magnificent scenery, stopping at viewpoints and turn-offs, and we spotted a herd of wild white mountain goats playing on the concrete crash barriers. Down in the town of Radium, I enjoyed another swim in the hot water springs, this time in lovely sunshine. Then we went for a walk to see one of the many waterfalls in the area. At the Red Streak campsite there's a herd of bighorn sheep, and this magnificent male has a radio collar so the rangers can monitor his ramblings. Along the Columbia River Valley, nestling below the Purcell Mountains, we drove through wetlands to Golden and into the Yoho National Park. At the Kicking Horse Resort, we took a ride on the Eagle Eye Gondola to the mountain summit up at 2,300 metres. Here we looked out at the view while drinking hot chocolate and eating a sumptuous cake, but were a bit miffed when a rider on an ATV came up the track, as they wouldn't let us ride our dirt bikes up the mountain. This is a ski resort in winter and a mountain bike downhill in summer, and on the way down again we passed over the bear enclosure, but fortunately they were all still asleep. The views of the Rockies up from that vantage point had been spectacular. As we left to climb back up to Highway 1, we passed this huge marshalling yard where the trains are organised, ready to pass through the famous Kicking Horse spiral tunnels. There were so many runaway trains coming down from the Rockies that engineers built tunnels into the mountainside so the trains can gain or lose height safely. We stopped for lunch at Emerald Lake, where we watched a canoeist arrive at the lodge. Then we set off again up the long, slow climb. Another stop at the Natural Arch waterfall was a welcome break, but the noise of the water being forced through the narrow gap was deafening. At last we reached the lowest viewing point for the spiral tunnels. The higher one was still closed due to snow. We watched a train disappear into the tunnel entrance, and the locomotive came out of the lower exit before the last car of the train had gone in higher up. Back on the Icefields Parkway, which is a 230-kilometre long road passing through the protected scenery of a continuous World Heritage Site, we turned north and drove through this magnificent scenery. Elk were grazing beside the road, and we had more bear sightings, a mother and cub on the railway line, and another black bear by the road, and 2 grizzlies. Wow! Up ahead we caught a glimpse of the massive ice fields before we pulled into Wilcox Creek Campground. Here we caused a traffic jam of European motorhomes as we chatted with Walter from Munich, who travels in an ex-military Iveco called Mooly, and a Dutch couple in a Comet. Later we found out that they had been along the Silk Route in their RV. Early next morning we set off for the Columbia Icefields, where the Athabasca Glacier is sliding into the Sunwapta Lake. At the Icefield Centre we took a ride on Brewster Ice Explorer to go out up the rough track onto the glacier. This is the largest accumulation of ice south of the Arctic Circle, straddling 2 Canadian national parks and 2 provinces, with meltwaters flowing into the Atlantic, Pacific and Arctic Oceans. The Columbia Icefield is immense. It was an expensive tour which lasted 90 minutes, and we spent 30 minutes out on the ice, which is 300 metres deep and will melt in 400 years' time. The vehicles have evolved and are very large, the tyres immense, and they lay big tracks in the ice, which is very dirty. No wonder really, with all the visitors that come here every day. Northwards again, with high cliffs on either side of the parkway, with long thin waterfalls crashing down, and more deep. Passing Nigel's Creek, we stopped to go and see the Sunwapta and Athabasca Falls, where the glacier meltwater rushes down through narrow gorges. Here we met Walter and his wife again and had conducted tours of each other's RVs. There was a bit of a drama on the Whistler campground in Jasper when smoke was seen coming from an Itasca RV, and the arranger arrived with his extinguisher, but the fire got worse. A volunteer fire truck arrived, brand spanking new, its very first call out, and the firemen soon put out the fire, which had burned a hole in the roof of the RV. Jim gave them some duct tape to stick tarpaulin over the damage, but the couple, who were from Michigan, could not continue on their journey north to Alaska. We visited the town of Jasper, and at the railway station admired an old steam locomotive, an observation coach that had a glass bubble on the roof, and spotted a Spider-Man diesel loco. We had a very long 370-kilometre drive west along Highway 16, down out of the park through forests, across rivers, and at our lunch stop the Dutch couple in the Comet arrived just as the kettle boiled. At the big city of Prince George, the northern capital of British Columbia, we found Walmart and the Dutch couple already parked. Here we stocked up with supplies and stayed overnight, then said our goodbyes as they were heading up around the loop to Dawson's Creek. After a chat with a local man who was originally from Scotland and his wife was from Cardiff, we headed west and at Vanderhoof pulled into Dave's RV park, where we camped in the garden full of lovely irises and lupins. It was good to be off the busy road, do the laundry and check out our supplies, as there's lots of English and French produce on sale in this area. At Darren's Beach Park we camped beside Stuart Lake near Fort St James. This fort began in 1806 as a fur trading post. It has now been restored to represent life as it was in 1896. The guides were in period dress and the buildings gave a good insight into the activities of a trading post where salmon was smoked and leather tanned. The warehouse was stocked with goods which would have been shipped in during the summer months, and the store sold goods at 19th century prices. Jim tried out the local beer in a barber's chair and just had to try on a hat. The traded fur pelts went out by boat across the lake, by pack mule to Barbeen Lake, along the Hazeltons and along the Skeena River to Prince Rupert, and by ship again round the Cape to Europe. This fort is mile 0 on the route. In winter no supplies arrived and the inhabitants lived on smoked salmon and whatever else they could trap. Life was harsh then, but now it was lovely, with glorious sunset over our campsite by the lake. At the nearby Cottonwood Park we visited a memorial up in the woods to Russ Baker, a seaplane pilot who was famous in this area and founded what is now Air Canada. The three-bladed prop on the memorial overlooking the lake was erected by his wife. Down on the shore is this old crane and a third-size model of a Junkers W34 fitted with a Daimler-Benz Hornet radial engine. The view across the lake was lovely as we ate our lunch. Returning to the highway, we continued west into the Lake District, and at Burns Lake we did some shopping, and at the motorbike shop found out we could get down to the Alcan campsite at Utsa Lake, as the road was now mainly tarred. First we stayed beside Chisinkut Lake, where every house had a seaplane moored. But the beaver resort facilities were abysmal. This, believe it or not, is the shower block. We headed off down the road towards Francois Lake to the ferry terminal and were a bit concerned that the bus may be too big for the boat. Then we saw the size of the logging trucks as they drove off. We were tiny. A serene sail across the lake, no charge, to the south side, then along the road through grassy plains where we saw this old car parked in the garage. At last we arrived at the free campsite where Ed and Kathy look after the Spills Lake Spillway that controls the water levels in Utsa Lake. This is a headwater for the hydroelectric plant at the aluminium works at Kitimat, and the company provide the campsite and services free of charge. It turned out to be just perfect. Free wood for the campfire, clean water, drop toilets and free beer, courtesy of Ed, and lots of wildlife. Only one other couple were here and we enjoyed tales around the campfire before Jim got down to fixing the hub bearing yet again and fitting new shock absorbers. He just loved getting down and dirty. A seaplane arrived to refuel and took off across the lake, and Jim lit the fire so I could cook the steaks. This place is idyllic, and out came the dirt bikes so we could explore the old logging tracks in the forest and ride beside the lake. We spotted a handwritten sign warning of sudden changes in water level, due mainly to the spillway, and we rode up a grassy knoll and parked the bikes and watched a bald eagle fishing in the river. And here we spotted our first log raft, huge number of logs floating on the water. We spotted a brown bear ahead as it crossed our track, and then we ate our lunch beside yet another lake before getting back to camp to enjoy the sunset. The view across the lake was awesome, as there is no habitation at all on the southern bank. The only thing to spoil this place is a black beetle that is attacking the pine trees, turning them brown. Out again next day, we went to ride the Cheslata Lake Trail, but it was difficult to find, as apparently the signs had been taken down to keep out poachers. We found it eventually, but the warm, moist air brought out hundreds of mosquitoes that could fly as fast as we could ride, so we turned round and went back to camp. The warm weather and friendly people made this one of our favourite campsites, and we were sorry to leave. Ed and Kathy provided us with a beautiful lunch, and when we came out to their bungalow we found we had a flat tyre. So it was back on the ferry at Francois Lake, have a new tyre fitted at Burns Lake, ready to head north up to Stewart, into Alaska, and then west to the Pacific Ocean.